Welcome to Immediatism, episode 168, Civil or Subversive, a Dark Matter Collection, Individualist Writings from the UK, the Introduction. Immediatism Podcast brings you essays provocative and incendiary. Hi, this is Corey. So we'll start something new today. I want to feature a book called Civil or Subversive, which is out from littleblackcart.com. and was originally published in the UK, so it really has a context and makes references to events that took place in the UK that my listeners and I may or may not be familiar with. But the messages here, the analysis is applicable broadly, and so this has a lot of value. I think we're going to appreciate this. I'll start out with reading the introduction to the Little Black Cart edition, which is just a little shorty. It's one page. So I'll read that here in this intro I'm doing now. And then this first episode will be the main introduction to the UK edition of the book. And then in episode 2, I'll share one essay that I've chosen. I haven't decided whether to go beyond that. So right now the plan is to do this episode is the introduction to the book, and the second episode will be a sample of one of the essays from the book. All right, here's that LBC intro. Politically incorrect and chaotic preface to the LBC edition. In a vast desert at the edge of my dreams where souls arrive at the abyss, we walked you as far as we could. As we walked, we told you who you were, who you'd been, who you would always be. We told you not to be afraid. The truth is now we cannot imagine how you would have lived, what rebel space would have been sufficient for you, what comrades would have been good enough, brave enough, true enough. We stopped talking and waited for the angel of death to take you, watched you walk where we cannot yet go. You have probably forgotten now, are busy learning to be somebody else, but nothing is over and everything continues until we meet again. Over 2 years have passed quickly since we published this collection of texts against what our dead comrade Darko Mathers termed civil anarchism. When we were collating this controversial booklet with him, we had no idea that it would go on to be so popular. We thank the comrades of Little Black Cart for the opportunity to spread this booklet further. Although largely concerning the situation in the UK, the appeal of the publication easily speaks to different contexts. At the time of printing, there had been a welcome rise in the number of anarchist attacks taking place, not only in UK, but in diverse places around the world, and it led to subsequent denunciations and censorship by the official anarchist movement of moribund federations and syndicates. To clarify, though, our target was never simply social anarchism, class struggle anarchism, or anarchist communism. Otherwise, in our sketchy critique, we would have named it so. A critique of citizenism and leftism in the broadest sense influences this collection of texts, and more specifically, certain critiques of civilization itself can be found within. Incendiary Greetings, Editors, August 2016. Right, so you will have gathered that this is an insurrectionary text, and I'll mark it so on Immediatism.com. You can click and get all of the insurrectionary texts there. The book is dedicated to Renzo Novatore and a couple of other individuals who will be named at the very end of the introduction piece. So let's go ahead with that introduction. Here it is. Introduction to Civil or Subversive, written by Darko Mathers. In the spring of 2012, I published a pamphlet called August 2011 Revolt, Anarchy in the UK, about the recent insurrectionary riots. In this pamphlet, I wrote about the fundamental divide between those of us who knew the moment was ours and those who found it was scary and horrifying, or at least problematic. I wrote about seeing my so-called non-political friends rising up and rioting. All our backs and forths about anarchism seemed irrelevant, knowing my friends loved real anarchy much more than many of the politico-anarchists I've met, who don't seem to have a drop of the spirit of revolt and anarchy in them. To me, it showed the domesticated irrelevance of the activists and their political circuses. It was real, human, not crippled by representation and politics. I went on. The 2011 August insurrection showed up the majority of UK anarchists and revolutionaries as cowardly citizens who, though they like to whine and complain about the evils of the world, are fundamentally content as passive slaves. Currently, most UK anarchists appear happily bitter simply to tag along behind state socialists and liberals as the impotent good conscience and or rowdy margin who wear black and use swear words. This is pathetic. Speaking the language of politics, of creating a reasonable and programmatic anarchist project, the result is an anarchism that's neither fish nor fowl. Failing both as political pragmatics and as anarchic rebellion, civil anarchism limps along sadly. Since then, other anarcho-insurrectionists in the UK have further criticized the people we've come to term civil anarchists, who, like good citizens, continue to talk and walk the road of obedience to the state and the reactionary mores of society. The liberalism and weakness of the extra-parliamentary anti-capitalist, anti-state social movements and political tendencies in the UK and of the individuals who make up this spectrum cannot be examined without looking at the social class context here. While the insurrectionary current has never disappeared in the UK, it's clear that, following the armed and conspiratorial Luddite insurgency in the early 19th century against industrialization, antagonism from the exploited was subdued by a combination of state terrorism and the recuperative influence of trade unionism and democratic socialism. The legalization of trade unionism alongside the extension of the vote and the inclusion of the working class in democracy via the Labour Party was an important factor in the domestication of a proletariat that once terrorized middle-class society and the rich. The fact that the move from rural feudalism and a more primitive mercantilism to industrial capitalism was brought about without a wholesale bloody revolution, such as happened in France, means that the UK ruling class and state system has a continuity and stability unlike many other parts of the world. The sickly cross-class social contract based on the spoils of imperialist empire poisons the minds and spirits of the people of the UK. The disgusting herd instincts of obedience to the law, fear of the antisocial and the unpopular, hatred of the other, institutional mediation, and social dialogue between the oppressed and the oppressors have been deeply rooted in large parts of the population through the democratic, social democratic system and the all-powerfulness of the law, its cops, courts, and prisons. We now find ourselves in a bleak and desolate landscape of law-abiding citizenism, spirit-impoverishing democratic protest, populist demagoguery that soothes the petty egos of the sold-out masses, and cowardly social cannibalism. So much for the old working class, but a bad dream haunts capital's social peace, the underclass excluded from production, disrespectful of the law and hungry for the impossible dream of the modern consumer lifestyle. The ghettoized excluded are a large minority of the population, largely without a stake in institutional mediation or a voice in the democratic arena, and are the enemy within that the state fears while using as a scapegoat immigrants, unemployed, lawbreakers, drug users, etc. As Alfredo Bonanno predicted from Riot to Insurrection 1988, the excluded have in general lost the common language with the included that formed the basis of the old reformism and social contract. The lack of major political violence and revolutionary struggle, and insurrections that have been sporadic and disorganized in time and in consciousness, means that while the UK has a very strong democratic social cross-class tradition, it lacks the sort of conflictual tradition of other European countries. This is the political landscape of the UK within which the anarchist far left is firmly situated. The civil anarchist phenomena is not confined to the workerist scene of internet forums and pub get-togethers, but likewise includes the soggy camp of the eco-activists. These two poles of the official movement are based around, on the one hand, the formal Anarchist Federation, AFED-IFA, the Solidarity Federation, SolFed-IWA, and the web collective Libcom, and on the other hand, Earth First, with local groupings and scenes gravitating toward these national tendencies. The workerists are no more than appendages of the far left, pretty much invisible to the wider population, functionally serving to drag young people, mainly from punk rock and left-wing politics, interested in an anti-state revolutionary perspective, into the dead end of theoretical dogmatism and a lifestyle of being something like a normal worker, pub, TV, beer, while doing the gritty working class organizing of handing out boring bulletins with info about public sector union action and economic statistics, perhaps going along to a tenants association or becoming a shop steward or such. These latter actions might be worthwhile activities for revolutionaries to undertake if they were part of a revolutionary projectuality based on creating real autonomous resistance. But the leadership of UK leftist anarchism, yes, of course there's a leadership of boring old blokes, have carefully removed any dangerous elements of anarcho-communist praxis and enjoy simply going on with their Dungeons and Dragons style of playing revolutionary. Hence, their hatred of the deceased tendency class war, which, despite its faults, was actually oriented toward revolutionary conflict, insurrection, and resistance. Hence the fact that the civil anarchist leadership tried their best to make sure none of the social insurrectionary theory and practice, developing in specifically Spain, Italy, and Greece, ever reached the ears of their members, who, like most English people, have a narrow island-based view and a poor or nil, like me personally, grasp on any foreign language. Cases like the libertarian communist comrade who researched crowd control for the police and was defended for this by the UK anarcho-workerists flesh out the picture, or the anarcho-communist revolutionary organization that stood by its sister group in Eastern Europe with Nazis against an anti-fascist prisoner, or the denouncements of revolutionary attacks on top taxmen, bankers, and nuclear industry bigwigs. The eco-activists, on the other hand, are a different kettle of fish, arising out of the anti-roads protest movement of the 1990s and the squat culture. They are more numerous and enjoy greater social support, playing a more important role in British politics by, on the most part, repeating spectacular political stunts that use the language and symbolism of civil democratic dissent. Feeding the image of debate and participation, modern totalitarianism hides its ugly fascist face to maintain its legitimacy. In fact, the essence of what I'm referring to as civil anarchism is what we could call a horizontal citizenism, which speaks the language of democracy, rights, laws, social inclusion, consensus, protest. Civil society is the non-governmental organizations of democracy and a key part of the spectacle of popular sovereignty. Apart from maintaining democracy's image of dialogue and permitted dissent, civil society also is a recuperating mediator and handily picks up services for the state and business, curbing some of their excesses to allow the smoother functioning of the system. Many anarchist, or rather libertarian, activists work for NGOs, trade unions, and the parasitic den of academia. There's a direct feedback loop through academia, activists, and the social bureaucracy about the bizarre language codes and identity politics of political correctness. Well, there's some theory or observations. Challenging the recuperators of anarchy is a pleasure. Fuck them and their stupid game. Following on from Subversive Dissociation, which outlines our broad critique, this little compilation of individualist anarchist essays against civil anarchism and for total liberation Dissociation continues with 3 pieces from 2011, published in 325 number 9. Here are outlined an anarcho-nihilist critique of spectacular and conformist anarchism and moral elitism, as demonstrated by some anarchists' reaction to the riots that shook the country earlier that year, alongside more in-depth critical notes on the UK anti-capitalist movement. Next are a few texts, Scandalous Thoughts and Violence, dealing with the denouncements and political bullshit that spewed from civil anarchists in 2012 following the kneecapping of a nuclear conglomerate CEO by anti-civilization anarchist group Olga Nucleus, FAI-IRF. Other essays lay out some of the individualist rebellious feelings, thoughts, and positions of contributors. Some were previously published in Dark Nights, 325 number 10, Disreputable Mavericks and Illegality, and Wolfie Landstryker's My Own, Into the Abyss, Chaos, Fragment, The She-Wolf. Others are brand spanking new. Issues explored include being true to yourself rather than following the herd, even a herd of friends, breaking with the certitudes of life, and rising up against the system. That concludes today's essay. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Immediatism. For more information and links, check the show notes at Immediatism.com. Immediatism is a project of Little Black Cart, selling anarchist books and ephemera at littleblackcart.com. Access thousands of texts of interest to anarchists for free at theanarchistlibrary.org, an archive providing high-quality PDFs in various sizes and formats, as well as plain text sources and an EPUB version for mobile platforms. The Anarchist Library actively encourages DIY printing and distribution. Simply select the texts you want, print double-sided, fold, and staple. Your booklet is ready to go. Please rate my podcast and subscribe to encourage this project. If there are other Little Black Cart books you'd like in podcast form, let me know. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Immediatism, episode 169, Subversive Dissociation by L. Immediatism Podcast brings you essays provocative and incendiary. Hi, this is Corey. What I have for you this time is an essay that I've chosen from the book Civil or Subversive. What I did last time was the introduction, which kind of laid out their point of view. And this one's going to lay out their analysis about what they call civil anarchy and a lot of other people call sort of leftist anarchists who are operating still within the political system, protesting and things like that. So this should be pretty interesting and relevant to everybody. I just want to plug the London Anarchist Bookfair 2020, which is taking place this coming weekend of the 17th of October, 2020. They've done quite a lot of outreach as far as publicizing it. I just checked A News and see that they have a torrent of 80 curated selections from theanarchistlibrary.org. So, you know, the Anarchist Library has many resources for you, and it looks like the London Anarchist Bookfair people have chosen 80 of them as a reading list. So you could go to anarchistnews.org, and there are actually a couple of things there to click about the book fair, so you could get more information there. There's going to be another book fair in England. I want to say Manchester, but I need to check my email, and it's a virtual one. So I'll let you know about that next podcast, or you could Google it and figure it out. So there's going to be a virtual book fair just like next weekend or in 1 or 2 weekends. So what I've been doing this last couple weeks by request is featuring UK authors, and Civil or Subversive was originally published in the UK under just a slightly different title. It was like Anarchy, Civil or Subversive, something like this. And that's available as a full PDF. And so I linked it in the show notes at Immediatism.com if you want to get the whole original PDF as it came out in the UK, maybe around 2012 or so. And some of these articles that are, some of the essays that are in the book were originally published in My Own, which was Wolfie Landstryker's Egoist newspaper. And, you can go back to the last episode 168, to figure out what is the source for each of the essays. And that'll give you a sneak preview of the whole book. Okay, so let's go ahead with this. Here we go. Subversive Dissociation. The critique of civil anarchism that has been put forward in a few fleeting texts by the nihilist egoist comrades of Dark Matter publications, and in an article by Venona Q, Scandalous Thoughts, has revitalized a needed rebuke against a typical, but not only, British line of thought. The critique hasn't yet aimed to be comprehensive or even far-reaching, as it consists of only a few sketches, but it has hit a nerve. For the best part of a decade, civil anarchism in Britain has been perfecting its theoretical denunciations unchallenged, so it is refreshing to see it being taken to task. This fragment is meant to be another contribution to refresh the critique of civil anarchism with some of my thoughts. If action is the defining feature of the new anarchic praxis that is antithetical to civil anarchism, I quote the CCF, Conspiracy of Cells of Fire, when they declare that comrades who honor their words with their actions constitute the most ideal beginning of an authentic dialogue between the tendencies of the anarchist movement. What we despise are the reformist fake anarchists who make comfort and cowardice their political theory and idealize it. Civil anarchism is not so much a political current, but an open term to outline the refuge of cowardly reformist and collaborative individuals who use anarchism as a crutch to escape the repression in society and the necessity to act. I don't take issue with these people or their civility based on the form of organization they adopt or the methods of direct action they choose. It is for them to persist in whichever way they like. It is not my concern, other than when they attempt to impose their will on me. I have nothing against mass organization per se, and see it as an observably fundamental principle of almost all revolutionary activity. But from being close to this civil anarchism for a considerable time, and having had space to consider its present development and direction, I believe this flock to have serious problems with allowing diversity of opinions and perspectives to be expressed that counters the groupthink party line. As anarchists, they believe in their heart, or at least their propaganda extols as much, that the human being, the bad animal, can be redeemed by their political program. Leaving that question aside for the moment, as anarchists, we appear to share more than we disagree about, and I concede that, followed to their conclusions, the ideas of the civil anarchists could be congruent with a social insurrection, but I doubt they will be. In Britain, one of the key values of civil anarchism seems to be activist political work as an end in itself, rather than as a means to an end. So instead of moving towards social conflict and insurrection, it placed itself inside a small niche in the media political spectacle and largely avoids putting itself at risk. It can do this also because democracy as a concept has been so completely misused for the neoliberal project that an attempt to clean up its image and get back to true and participatory democracy, or citizenship and civil investment in government, is beginning to seem radical, although it is not. Anarchist legalism does not claim its force of negation, but becomes indistinguishable from the democratic politics it pretends to go beyond. Civil anarchism will never evolve into an identifiable feature of conflict on the social terrain because it has no specific nature. It follows the crowd and jealously picks at the heads of those who dare calculate their refusal ahead of the rest. These grouplets are often so concerned with protecting their own existence in the face of society that they adopt the position least troubling to power and act simply as interest groups for very marginalized people who are isolated and seeking power. Through the psychological substitution of power by the mechanism of the formal organization, they attempt to hide bad behavior with political reasoning. This is to reject, censor, and vilify individuals and groups that they cannot control or influence, as they attempt to police the behavior of others. Civil anarchism turns on any anarchist or activist who dares reject the groupthink and organize themselves outside of acceptable limits. And like all political groups, the civil anarchists tend toward homogeneity, centralization, hierarchy, delegation, and censorship, however much it is all dressed up as consensus. Despite the insistence that these methods of organizing are actually something radical, they are casual with almost no difference to the style of library and creche rota found in community groups everywhere. If some anarchists find strength in this, I think they are naive about what they're fighting against. Capital is not something that can be fought in the workplace or one's community with certainty anymore, unless I have mistaken the last 30 years of global economic restructuring and class recomposition as a victory for classical anarchist methods. I may be wrong, but I do not see any future for the traditional forms of anarchist organization, as the social model they rested on has not only been defeated by capitalism, the conditions in which it had any relevance have changed. This naturally brings me to my further point. What is revolutionary or even anarchist about the adoption of Marxian and left communist thought? I'm not sure, though from my 2 decades of personal experience, I would say not much. In the past couple of years, the anarchist insurrectionalist groups created a cross-border destructive solidarity and next-generation urban struggle. It is ridiculous to think that such groups come out of nothing and have no positive relevance. Civil anarchist methods and ideas have long been irrelevant in the struggle of the countries where they are largely based, if they were ever relevant at all in some places. But some claim a definitive historical legacy and method of practice and theory, and that is a starting point for my antagonism towards them, coinciding with my refusal to accept the so-called anarchist disavowal of individual action and propaganda by deed. I think it is accurate to say that the fullness of anarchist praxis, from organizing in workplaces through to assassinations, is being reduced by these civil anarchist groups to only those methods not to be seen as alienating to democratic society. This is not the vision of the classical era social anarchists, so these latter-day groups have no right to claim any historical legitimacy. The conclusion is that I declare myself an antagonist to the fiction of civil anarchism and its aims. While this fragment does not focus on the social level of struggle in its entirety and is written in good faith to those who can be bothered to try and understand my points, this text is simply a short polemic and not particularly comprehensive or even coherent in its direction. With that in mind, I point out that the following verdicts have been issued by anarchist management in Britain as elsewhere. Dangerous publications and antisocial ideas, particularly anti-civilization ones, are forbidden. Claiming your actions in life of refusal, sabotage, and attack is forbidden. Expressing solidarity with specific anarchist prisoners and projects, often named terrorists, is forbidden. If what you would expect from a vibrant revolutionary tendency is courage, discussion, debate, and interchange, you'll be disappointed, as civil anarchism is not interested in your opinions, only your compliance. When they're not looking away whilst comrades are being imprisoned, they're often helping with the repression because they despise the idea of being misrepresented in the media and resent the anarchists of praxis for their actions. But the anarchists of praxis represent no one but themselves, and their actions belong solely to them, not to the movement. I dedicate this article to all those who are investigated and detained in Italy. That concludes today's essay. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Immediatism. For more information and links, check the show notes at Immediatism.com. Immediatism is a project of Little Black Cart, selling anarchist books and ephemera at littleblackcart.com. Access thousands of texts of interest to anarchists for free at theanarchistlibrary.org, an archive providing high-quality PDFs in various sizes and formats, as well as plain text sources and an EPUB version for mobile platforms. The Anarchist Library actively encourages DIY printing and distribution. Simply select the texts you want, print double-sided, fold, and staple. your booklet is ready to go. Please rate my podcast and subscribe to encourage this project. If there are other Little Black Cart books you'd like in podcast form, let me know. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Immediatism episode 151, Desert Chapter 4, African Roads to Anarchy. Immediatism Podcast brings you essays provocative and incendiary. Hi, so we're going to move into Chapter 4 right now, which has information about peasant life, everyday peasant life, people without governments, commons resurgent as global trade retracts, and outwitting the state. I want to go ahead and mention that the London Anarchist Bookfair is taking place on the 17th, the weekend of the 17th of October. And kind of in honor of that, I'm doing a few authors from the United Kingdom. So these are all British authors. Desert. I'll do something else from John Moore. And I'll do some of the selections from a book entitled Civil or Subversive, which is a collection of British authors' writings on anarchism. So that's kind of the plan. Those are what are coming up in the next week or two. And here we go with Chapter 4. Enjoy. Desert, Chapter 4, African Roads to Anarchy, including anarchic elements in everyday peasant life, peoples without governments, commons resurgent as global trade retracts, and outwitting the state. Anarchic elements in everyday peasant life. To examine future possibilities for liberty in peasant life, let's, as an example, look to the continent most often written off. These days, Africa has an image problem: war, famine, disease, and charity appeals. As time goes on, this skewed view of a diverse continent will be further exaggerated by worsening climate change and the interventions of disaster capitalism. In the previous sections, we saw that climate change will cause and exacerbate civil wars, largely through increasing the scarcity of food, water, and cultivatable soil. Many envision these future conflicts as a generalization of the image they hold of present-day Africa. In doing so, they are mostly mistaken. Most of Africa's current wars are fueled more by the presence of resources and less by their scarcity. Retractions in global trade should deny oxygen to some of these fires. For instance, as the oil runs out, areas such as the Niger Delta, under siege by state and corporate oil interests, are likely to become once again backwaters rather than battlegrounds. I take it as a given that we will not see an Africa-wide conversion to Western-originated anarchism, so what societies evolve into will in large part be defined by what they are now. And here is some good non-news from Africa. In many places and on many levels, its cultures have significant anarchic characteristics, with a minority being functioning anarchies. I'll hand over for a moment to Sam Ba, a Nigerian anarcho-syndicalist. Quote, to a greater or lesser extent, many traditional African societies manifested an anarchic eloquence which, upon closer examination, lends credence to the historical truism that governments have not always existed. They are but recent phenomena and are therefore not inevitable in human society. While some anarchic features in traditional African society exist largely in past stages of development, some of them persist and remain pronounced to this day. What this means is that the ideals underlying anarchism may not be so new in the African context. What is new is the concept of anarchism as a social movement ideology. Anarchy as abstraction may indeed be largely unknown to Africans, but is not at all unknown as a way of life. Manifestations of anarchic elements in African communities were, and to some degree still are, pervasive. These include the partial or complete absence of hierarchical structures, state apparatuses, and the commodification of labor. To put this in positive terms, some societies were and are largely self-managed, egalitarian, and republican in nature. Unquote. The extent to which Africa is viewed as a basket case in world opinion is in part the extent to which its societies are anarchic and not fully enclosed within capitalist relations. Why have anarchic social relations survived in Africa to such a degree? Jim Feast, writing for the American anarchist magazine Fifth Estate, has some answers. Quote, in sub-Saharan Africa, aside from in the minority of countries with a large white settler population and valuable resources, such as diamonds or copper, there was little penetration of capitalist agricultural forms or government into the interior. In the colonial era, the imperial powers had only limited goals. There was no desire to invest resources to ensure the state could project its authority into every corner of the new colonies. And after independence, settler states excepted, Africans remained only marginally affected by the market. They increasingly traded in the market, but their base was still a homestead and family farm, where a subsistence ethos prevailed. The salient points are these. No matter how wide the impact of world capitalism, much of sub-Saharan Africa has not been effectively shaped by state or market power. Moreover, while in many parts of the planet there is a struggle to develop an alternative economy, in the parts of Africa under discussion, a robust subsistence economy unconcerned with profit and capital expansion continues to exist. Unquote. Peoples without governments. While anarchic elements are pervasive in Africa, there are also entire anarchist societies. Some of these exist surrounded by more incorporated populations, while others are truly remote from external power through luck or active avoidance. Environments that are not conducive to empire are a significant factor behind the survival of some of these cultures and their ability to defend their autonomy. A number have remained anarchic within themselves whilst superficially accepting outside power. This should not necessarily be seen as assimilation. Governments don't like to let outright opposition go unpunished, lest it encourage others, yet they don't always have the capacity to fully internalize pre-existing or maroon societies, especially wily ones. For the community, the state power and the alien political structure are so different and so powerful that direct resistance soon proves to be unaffordable. Passive accommodation is impossible as well. The most acceptable possibility is some kind of collaboration that allows things to continue almost as before, with the idea that we were here before them and we will be here after them. In some situations, this is as simple as unspoken contracts approximate to, we'll pretend you're governing us, you pretend to believe it. In other situations, outwitting the state may involve a complex set of tactics, including providing key functions, retraditionalization, regular movement, and manipulating the balance of competing external powers. Some may object that these anarchies are not those we would design if we were to sit down and plan the so-called ideal society for them, but they are anarchies nonetheless. Though far more egalitarian than surrounding societies, they usually have some level of sex and age stratified power relations, a division of labor, and sometimes rely on animal slavery. I don't view any of these things as good, but it should be remembered that to differing extent, these are aspects of all civilized societies. At least these cultures don't have class warfare or the state. In this sense, they are anarchies, even if they don't conform to all the aspirations of Western-originated anarchisms. They should not be idealized any more than present-day Chiapas or 1936 Barcelona, and you don't have to support them, but these are existing anarchies, the active social creation of millions of people through time, resisting the concentration of power. Any overview of possibilities for liberty would be foolish to ignore them. Those of us who are freeing ourselves from authority can find insights, inspiration, and warnings from their examples. Commons resurgent as global trade retracts. For those in Africa, the fact that anarchies exist and some anarchic tendencies remain widespread beyond them leaves routes of escape and survival open that can be used as authorities collapse, retract, or are destroyed. It should be noted that many commons-based societies within Africa are fallback positions that were turned to after complex kingdoms collapsed or were dismantled by invading empires, both Western and African. While colonial elites often policed through local traditional authorities, they came to blows with them too. Dominant classes act in their own interest, not in that of an abstract system of hierarchical power. The attack on local authority by outside elites opened up possibilities for anarchy in the past, and this pattern continues. Jim Feast once again. Here's an irony of history. In the last 15 years, in some parts of the industrially undeveloped world, the state has withered away, not because of its supersession, but due to the extension of global capitalism. Talk of state collapse on capital's periphery doesn't mean governments have completely vanished, but that many states have diminished from the totalized agencies of control we experience in northern tier countries. Since independence, most sub-Saharan African countries have been one-party states, headed by corrupt strongmen who rule by combining military coercion with the distribution of favors to well-placed followers. The intelligent strongman sees that not only his immediate cronies who staff the state, but tribal leaders of every significant stripe must be cultivated by financing infrastructural projects that offer prime opportunities for graft in their bailiwicks. But with structural adjustment policies forced upon these nations, this form of government has often ceased to exist because funds to sustain the patronage networks are no longer there. In a movement to shore up elite rule, there has been a widespread morphing into multi-party democracies. From 1988 to 1999, the number of states in sub-Saharan Africa featuring multi-party elections went from 9 to 45. This temporarily and cynically solves two problems for state rule. It restores a patina of legitimacy to a system that can no longer provide either patronage or welfare services to its citizens, and reinvigorates it by dividing clients among the competing parties, so each political grouping has need to siphon fewer funds since it serves a smaller client base. Another loss of state power is the inability of it to provide minimal welfare to the citizenry, such as education and medical care, which structural adjustment programs eliminate as too costly. While some of these services are taken over by international relief organizations, most that continue are done so by groups from the distressed society itself. In other words, as Thompson puts it, declining state capacity required civil society to increase its self-sufficiency. The once repressed women's groups, trade unions, farmers' associations, and other grassroots networks are assuming greater responsibility in social and economic life. So maybe here we are seeing an African road to anarchism, whereby the money economy and the state, which are in a condition of partial collapse or withdrawal, cede more and more functions to non-monetarized, non-statist village communities that are organized on the basis of mutual aid. Unquote. This is already happening in some areas in a non-newsworthy manner without overt conflict. In others, this revitalization of the commons is one of the forces filling the power vacuum left by the warring fragmentation of failed states. The structural adjustment mentioned is, of course, time-specific. There is an ebb and flow of projects of power, as the expansion of China into Africa shows. But nevertheless, the process observed is a pointer to what may happen in many places as global trade retracts in a resource-poor, climate-changed world. Outwitting the state. As well as those we could mischievously label lifestyle anarchists, Africa has a growing, though still small, number of groups organizing under the banner of anarchism. These are unlikely to change the faces of the entire continent, but may play significant roles in emergent movements and struggles. To repeat the earlier quote from Seaweed, any bioregion can be liberated through a succession of events and strategies based on the conditions unique to it. Even if we accept accept the foreclosure of any possibility of global anarchist revolution. There is no reason to say a regional anarchist insurrection somewhere in Africa or elsewhere is not on the cards, and this is made more likely by the factors we have discussed already. In probably overly optimistic terms, Sam Mabah states, quote, "The process of anarchist transformation in Africa might prove comparatively easy, given that Africa lacks a strong capitalist foundation, well-developed class formations, and relations of production, or a stable entrenched state system," unquote. While a surprising number of African dirt roads lead to anarchy, much of what we have touched on here relates to many rural areas across the planet to differing degrees. For instance, in his excellent The Art of Not Being Governed, James C. Scott recounts numerous examples of lived anarchies in upland Southeast Asia. Even outside of anarchies, peasant communities whose self-sufficiency has not been entirely vanquished still often retain high levels of autonomy. Land is liberty. Sadly, in many places, communal traditions have been eradicated, the commons or wilderness enclosed, and farmers forcefully transformed into wage laborers. In others, however, they have not, for a diverse set of reasons, not least of which is resistance. States do not always get their own way. The tide of Western authority will recede from much, though by no means all, of the planet. A writhing mess of social flotsam and jetsam will be left in its wake. Some will be patches of lived anarchy, some of horrible conflicts, some empires, some freedoms, and of course unimaginable weirdness. As states recede and fail through entropy, stupidity, revolution, internal conflict, climate stress, people will continue to dig, sow, herd, and live, most admittedly in vastly more challenging climates, and few with the guarantee of a peaceful life. In many places, commodified land will be reclaimed as commons, and new communities will be formed by refugees from the collapsed economies. Anarchic societies, old and new, will need to defend their liberty and lives through avoidance, arms, flight, and outwitting the state. We have glimpsed some of the possibilities opened up and closed by both climate wars and the retraction of state governance from rural communities. But what about liberty at the shifting outer borders of civilization? And what of liberty beyond those borders, in the wild? That concludes today's essay. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Immediatism. For more information and links, check the show notes at Immediatism.com. Immediatism is a project of Little Black Cart, selling anarchist books and ephemera at littleblackcart.com. Access thousands of texts of interest to anarchists for free at theanarchistlibrary.org, an archive providing high-quality PDFs in various sizes and formats, as well as plain text sources and an EPUB version for mobile platforms. The Anarchist Library actively encourages DIY printing and distribution. Simply select the texts you want, print double-sided, fold, and staple. Your booklet is ready to go. Please rate my podcast and subscribe to encourage this project. If there are other Little Black Cart books you'd like in podcast form, let me know. Thanks for listening.